Our next presenter will tell us how CPG brands can thrive through disruption. He is Brandon Strauss, SVP with Shopkick. Brandon, the podium is yours.
Oh, awesome. Thank you, John. I appreciate being here. And either good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're at. As John said, my name's Brandon Strauss. I'm the SVP of Sales at Shopkick. It's great to be here at Lead 2025 with some of the most forward-thinking marketers in the industry, and I'm really excited to be here today. Today we're tackling something that we all face, which is disruption, right? It's not just part of the job anymore; it is the job. And nowhere is that more obvious than the shelf. The challenge is really turning shelf disruption into really strategic advantages. And that's what we're here to talk about today. How we redefine the point of sale, not just as a destination, but a dynamic moment of engagement and conversion. So when we think about this as brands and as marketers, like what we should be doing, we really need to reframe the shelf as a strategic marketing channel, not just that merchandising endpoint that we believe it might be. We also need to make activations at shelf a core part of any omni-channel planning or strategy that we're out there implementing today. So, as we move forward here, you don't need me to sit here and tell you that the landscape is turbulent, right? But what we want to focus on here is not just the chaos, but more importantly, how do we win? Consumers haven't stopped buying, but how they buy, what influences them, and how when they convert, all of that has changed and it continues to change on a daily basis. The shelf is still the final mile, but the journey to get there is anything but linear. So as brands, we really need to sit down and take a look in the mirror and really write things down and map out that new consumer path from that moment of inspiration, that moment of awareness, all the way down to that point of conversion of them putting into that cart and then going into checkout. We need to make sure that we have aligned media and execution teams that plan with agility and not rigidity that's out there, right? We have to be agile. We have to be able to make moves in real time to adjust to the things that are happening in the marketplace today. So, to be honest, overall, and I'm not saying anything new here, but we'll call it like it is. Retail is hard. And really, if you look back over the past 15 years, it has been relentless for retail. I mean, just think about all of the hits that we've taken. And I know I don't have every single one on here because it would have clouded the whole slide overall. But you go back at 2007, 2008, you had the global financial crisis that slams demand. It's made CPGs stash their budgets. You had the 2020, we had the pandemic that broke supply chains around the world and really changed shopper habits overnight. And we had to pivot from them. Going now since that point, we've had a myriad of other things that have come into play. We've had labor shortages. We've had runaway inflation. There's been tariff volatility, massive shrink, and now unprecedented pressure from retailers for perfect execution at scale. You know, like all of that, just think about that for a minute. That is a lot, right? And the result from it is that the landscape is tougher, it's faster, and it's more unforgiving than ever before. And the shelf, that moment where brands either convert or collapse, hasn't gotten any easier. It's become more complex, more scrutinized, and more vital to your success. You think back and you're looking at some of these things on here. Retail theft alone, according to National Retail Federation, hit $112 billion in 2024. That was up 26% year over year. And the effect of that happening is it's changed dynamics within retail to where you're starting to see more products behind glass, making it harder to really drive an experience with your consumers and with your shoppers. It makes them harder to get to the product. It makes them harder for willing to buy because they have to hunt down people to find it. We've also seen that 80% of CPG leaders have cited cost and supply chains unpredictability has really hit their margin threats, according to McKinsey. And we're seeing cost have risen another 8.2% in 2024, forcing brands and yourselves to cut those SKUs, stretch those media dollars, and find smarter ways to win with less that's out there. But here's the kicker. Performance isn't performance expectations have not gone down at all, right? If anything, they've gone up. Retailers want faster turnarounds. Finance teams want cleaner ROI, and shoppers, they want better value, better personalization, and a better reason to buy every single time. So when you take that all into context, what are the things that we need to do? Understanding on this is, we need to build retail resilience into our planning. We need to replace really fixed shelf plans with agile playbooks that allow for mid-cycle optimization. We need to include contingency triggers for supply disruptions, retailer shifts, and execution breakdowns. Secondly, we need to tighten that feedback loop between our planning and our execution, using near real time store level data to monitor executions and adapt messaging or media when breakdowns occur. Aligning trade and media spend to prioritize locations and moments where execution is strong. And third, we need to rethink ROI through a shopper's lens. Don't just measure impressions or sell-in. We need to focus on trial. We need to focus on conversion. We need to focus on lift. We need to focus on return visits. We need to focus on getting products in hands and having that true experience in store and that engagement with those products. And we need to allocate our media dollars, from broad awareness to conversion triggering tactics at the physical shelf itself. And then lastly, we need to simplify and we need to prioritize and focus. In an environment with reduced shelf space, with fewer shopper trips, every activation we need to do more with less. We need to focus on the highest impacting SKUs with clean messaging, executional excellence, and not scale for scaling's sake overall. Now, when we get in and we think about it, we are operating in a landscape today of disruption, and it's no longer episodic, right? It is a permanent state that we operate in. So whether it's economic volatility, shifting shopper expectations, or retailer pressures, we are in this constant state of adjustment where we need to be agile and we need to have the ability to pivot. And yet, despite all this turbulence, one thing that has not changed, the shelf is still where everything comes to a head. It is the convergent points where brands promise, media investments, and shopper intention and retailer execution all meet together, and where the shopper makes their final decision in just a matter of seconds. According to McKinsey, over 60% of final purchases decisions are made at the physical shelf, right? So if you think about that, right, you spend thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to get in front of shoppers across the open web or where they're at on their day-to-day lives today, right? 90% of shoppers today find out about products, through those channels that are right there. But when they get to that moment when they can make the purchase, more than half of those purchases that they are making, they still have not made that decision. And most specifically, when they're in the shelf. So that is that in that moment right there, brands are not just competing with adjacent SKUs. You're also competing with the entire universe. Because to compound things and make things even more difficult, 54% of shoppers are still browsing online while they're in the store and while they're in the aisles. They're checking price, they're reading reviews, they're looking at coupons, they're weighing their options, all while standing there at the shelf. So it's extremely critical to make sure that we're winning that moment with those shoppers to make sure that they're grabbing your product as opposed to your competition or as opposed to private label that's there. And even more critical, 71% of all of those in-store sales that happen are digitally influenced. And that came from Deloitte, a report from Deloitte. So that means that the decision at shelf is being shaped by everything upstream: digital ads, your influencer content, past experience, mobile engagements. And when we get it wrong, we lose that moment. Nielsen reports that 42% of shoppers have walked away from a purchase due to poor in-store execution, whether that's missing signage or worst case, an empty shelf, right? And then lastly, potentially inconsistent messaging. So yet, too often retail execution is still treated as that last mile checklist that we're doing in strategic, but it is that really strong performance strategic lever that we need to make sure that we're pulling and we need to make sure that we have cohesion with when we're driving this home. So when we think about what we need to do, in this area here, we need to unify the physical and digital shelf strategies. Shoppers no longer see a line between the store aisle and their mobile screens. Brands must deliver consistent and connected messaging across both areas. That means ensuring pricing, claims, visual, promotions are all aligned. You know, that's from e-commerce PDPs to in-store signage to anything that you're putting out there on the mobile web. It all needs to be cohesive and be saying the same thing. Secondly, we need to treat the shelf for as a real-time decision environment. You know, leveraging behavioral and locational data to understand when and where shoppers are most open to influence. Adapting your retail media strategies to serve conversion content at these critical moments, and not just blanket awareness overall. We need to build shelf visibility into the upstream of campaign planning. If execution doesn't land at the shelf, the shoppers won't either. You know, including field marketing and retailer teams and supply chain partners in campaign planning early will ensure that we have synchronized execution when it comes to launching in market. And lastly, we really do need to anticipate disruption and not just react to it. We need to plan for multiple shelf scenarios based on inventory, channel shifts, retailer mandates, and those retailer mandates do come quite consistently. We need to layer in programs that are modular and adaptable, especially in high velocity categories where out of stocks and price sensitivity are extremely common overall. And why this is extremely important is because, the shopper today moves extremely fast, and man, have their expectations have only climbed overall. Today's shopper is not brand loyal. They are value loyal. And value and loyalty, I think, come in a lot of different flavors when you think about it. But the shopper, they expect offers that feel personal to them, experiences that are seamless, and engagement that feels very relevant. When you're kind of looking at these pillars that we have listed here on the screen, starting off at channel agnostic, Numerator had a study that came out earlier this year or at the end of last year, where they were talking about the consumer in 2025 is more increasingly adapting, a treasure hunt approach, for grocery shopping and shopping in general, right? They're visiting multiple locations to find the best deal and the best product availability. They took a look at March 2023 through February 2024, I believe, and consumers purchased groceries from an average of 20.7 different retailer locations. That's a lot, right? And that's a 23% increase over 2019 to 2020. So that's taking out, kind of those COVID times that we have there. So that's really an increasing when you think about it, like, and you're trying to drive actions at retail, how does it fit in and how does our strategy play to make sure that we're getting in front of shoppers at the right time in the right place, but we're influencing those outcomes at the place where we need it most, which is at self or at the specific retailer where we want that to happen. Secondly, personalization, it's a must have. I mean, it's really table stakes today. 91% of shoppers prefer personalized experiences. They expect the brands to speak to them, not just speaking to them in advertising across the web, but speaking to them in the store. Making an experience that's personalized to them, that speaks to them, is absolutely key. Loyalty is continuing to be challenged, and it's very conditional at the end of the day. McKinsey came out with a study that stated that 72% of shoppers switched brands last year for price or convenience. Think about that. You spend a ton of money on research, on packaging, on loyalty, trying to get people to be loyal to your brand, but we're seeing a high velocity of them making those switches due to economic conditions that are potentially out there today. Just recently, I was at another conference, and they were talking about, the trade down to private label has increased 14% just over the past couple of months. It's there, and that's only predicted to come. What that's done is that's created squeezes at retail to where you're losing shelf space to more private label as retailers are trying to adapt to those trends to maximize. And on top of those three things, which are really fundamental and challenging in themselves, where people are bouncing around to different locations, they expect everything to be personalized, they're not as loyal as they used to be, is that, we have to go out there and we have to drive attention. We have to drive awareness for our products. Well, problem is people don't have a really good attention span all over. I mean, we think our kids are bad. We are just as bad as well. Microsoft talked about the average attention span of consumers out there is about 8.25 seconds. So just me saying in that last second, I probably lost some of you guys in your attention span that was based just on that, right? So, their attention is scarce. And if you think about all of the money that's spent, on average, shoppers are seeing anywhere from 5 to 10,000 branded messages per day. So, how are we getting relevant to be personalized, to break through that noise, break through that clutter, and make sure we are getting that full attention that's there? And then lastly, it's not just about getting that impression in front of them or getting your name in front of them. It's how do you drive true engagement? How do you drive people to actually pick up a product? How do you get them to look at your product and engage with it, to want to learn more, to really explore and understand that reason to buy and why they should be putting that into their cart or not? So, so when we think about it, ec- uh, execution failure and promotion overload and reduced SKU space, these are all hurting. These are all hurting conversions at the end of the day, right? What used to be simple, shelf blocking, is now a complex fight for shopper confidence overall. I mentioned this stat earlier before, but with 42% of shoppers, abandoning purchases due to out of stocks and signage failure, you know, being consistent and making sure that we don't have these disconnected experiences is highly key, right? And that comes into those execution breakdowns as well. Also, too, you get into that personalization. IRI came out and talked about, promotional spend. About 48% of that is wasted because it's not speaking to the shopper in the right way, right? So, what do we need to do with that, right? We need to sit there and really, reduce the clutter in what's going on and how we're execution. We need to align the in-store promotions with high performing, digital interactions that can really complement what we're trying to do, what we're trying to do in store. We need to prioritize execution accuracy by focusing on how do we put the right promotion in front of the right shopper in the right time in the right place to get them to do what we want them to do, which is to pick up our product. And then lastly, we need to really make sure that we're leveraging all of the data that's available to us, understanding that shopper behavior to really justify the shelf space, but also to support and provide you with that rationalization and that defense that's needed as to why you need to do the things that you need to do to move things forward. Overall, the shelf itself, it's no longer a place. It is an advertising stack. It's a technology stack in itself because you need technology to move it forward. And when we think of the shelf itself, we can no longer view this as a separate type of play from how we're going out there with media. We need to bring together both the media teams and the retail teams together when we're looking to do executions. And it has, and when we're doing this, it has to look more than just good. It has to convert intelligently, consistently, and fast at the end of the day. We've seen, and BCG came out with this and talked about like when organizations have very tight sales and marketing integration, that can drive revenue growth by 2.5x, right? Because you are fully aligned with what sales is looking to do, your media is there. We have those cohesive messages. We are being personalized to those shoppers, really drives home that impact to make sure that they're having that great experience at shelf and picking up your product. You know, we know that those digital experiences drive those in-store activities with 71% of in-store sales actually being digital influenced. 90% of about shoppers find out about a product online. They're using that information as they're going in store, and we still know 54% are sitting there actually doing that research, in front of those products, which one should they buy or which one they shouldn't. And that point of decision is going to be key. So specifically what we need to do here is we need to think about this and we need to treat the shelf as an integrated performance channel. It's no longer a separate channel. It is an integrated channel into everything that we do. We need to align, and our teams need to make sure that they're aligned on, conversion KPIs. It's not just about awareness. It's not just about display compliance, you know, and we need to invest in the tech that connects, in aisle activations to the upstream market. And I think this is really key here because when you think about, you know, making optimizations in real time, or you think about changes that need to happen in real time, we need to understand what is happening at the shelf to be able to make those changes. We can no longer operate in a world where we execute a plan and then 90 days afterwards we're getting results to make those decisions on what we're doing forward. We need to understand this stuff in real time so we can make sure that we're making the decisions at the right time in the right place to really drive the most activation and the most sales for us overall. And when we think about winning brands and the brands that do win in this area, they are already today. They are not thinking as the shelf as static anymore. They are already viewing it as dynamic, as measurable, as digital. They're not building annual plans. They're building performance systems that react in real time. 63% of CPGs, according to Forrester, call real-time shelf data their top growth driver. And if we think about being able to have access to that data, understanding your in stocks, your out of stocks, more importantly, understanding consumer reactions to your brands at that point of decision is invaluable data that you can use to increase your performance overall. So when we look at what brands should do, you should really shift your planning to include test and learn cycles for the shelf. Try different things out, see what is really resonating with those shoppers, bring in those insights and bring that data to make those changes. Incorporating data, whether that be mobile data, whether that be point of sale data, whether that be real world signals or locational insights that are there, making sure that we have that all available to us to truly do understand what is happening with our product at retail. No two stores are created equal. Everyone is different. We need to make sure at retail, where are we performing and where are we falling short, because those are the areas where we can apply pressure to influence change overall. And we need to make sure that we allocate spend into platforms that optimize in real time. And I just talked about that a second ago, but I do think it's really important being able to make those adjustments in real time, being able to get the real time feedback from shoppers that are engaging with your products, being able to understand what's in, what's out, where do you need to stock up, are all key and invaluable to driving success overall. So when we think about, so just going to pause here for a second, and really to win at shelf, you need to be firing on all cylinders, right? Data, timing, execution, and relevance. Those four things are no longer optional, right? They are the new table stakes of what needs to happen. So us brands and marketers, what we really need to do here is we need to take a deep dive into the mirror and really audit the current retail stack. How many of these areas of those four are we getting information or are you making decisions in real time on, right? And then secondly, we need to focus and create those cross-functional ownerships within our organizations for shelf performance. This is not just a marketing problem. This is not just a sales problem. This is a combined problem in making sure what we're saying out there in the market is resonating in store. And then as we're driving those shoppers there, they're having that same experience that they saw when they first found out about the product that was out there. So those things are absolutely going to be key for us. And those are the winning moments that if we're able to do that correctly are the ones that win, and then they're the ones that convert overall. So, today it's not just enough to show up. You must win. You must win the moment. You either need to win that with offers, you need to win that with experience, you need to win that with touch points that actually drive decision making. Whether we're taking somebody from surfing the open web to bringing them into the store, whether they're sitting on their couch and we're taking them into the store and into the aisle to engage with your product, whether they're driving and they're seeing that sign. How are we making sure that those moments that we are creating, the clutter that we're breaking through in that noise, that we're grabbing that attention and really driving the meaningful action of driving them into store, right? Hey, 90% of people find out about a product online, but still 80%, more than 80% of purchases are happening within the physical brick and mortar store. And a lot of those decisions are being made at that point of decision when they're sitting there center aisle, kind of looking at those shelves and making that decision at that point. And by having a really true, strong, tied together omni-channel strategy, that can generate significant results for you. Nielsen decided that is actually can help to generate 23% higher ROI that's there. We've seen alone just at Shopkick that, we've seen 3.4x lift in purchase intent when you have very strong engagement that drives people to shelf, that allows them to engage with the product, learn about a product, and get a more of a reason to buy and put that in their cart versus the competition. So, with brands, what we need to do here, is we need to really bridge the media to the shelf using platforms that track full funnel outcomes. We need to use shopper incentives to influence decision making. And again, going back, thinking about that loyalty that's there. Um, what are we doing to incentivize and influence that decision making? And influencing that decision making doesn't mean it has to be a race to the bottom on price. It could be, what is the value that we are providing holistically by them buying this product versus the other. And we really need to double down on behavioral targets. Again, proximity. Where is that shopper? Are they close to this retailer location? Are we getting them to interact with that right product that we want them to buy? Are we giving them options of products that they can take a look at that's there? And those are really key things that we need to make sure that if we have all of these moments covered, that we are converting and driving the most actionable behavior overall.
We had a question.
Yeah.
Question come in, Brandon.
Yeah.
What are your best suggestions for how to best evaluate shelf performance success?
Yeah, so evaluating shelf performance and success, that's a good question. So I would say there's a lot of factors that go into your shelf performance and your success overall. I mean, obviously there's the age old, like, hey, are our sales increasing? Are they improving? I think a lot of things come into it in regards to restocks that are going in. I think also looking at how often we are out of stock and really what is the shopper's experience with your product is a kind of a key indicator of success overall, right? I think that's a blind spot that we run into a lot of times, is knowing what is that true experience. We have that planogram of how we think things are supposed to look, but do they actually look that way when the shopper is going and engaging? Is that placement right? Do we have the right UPCs that are listed there? Are we in stock, out of stock? Is that experience the same thing that's there? So I think being able to measure and understand what is that true shopper experience that's happening with the product, really that's tied to that messaging that we're putting out there in market, is a key indicator of success. And then you compound that on to taking a look at the sales and the increases that are coming through as well.
Okay, thank you.
And then, so, when we look at, to succeed at the shelf today, brands need to have more than just presence, right? They need participation. So what that means is that you have to build programs that are relevant to the shopper, responsive to their behavior, and more importantly, measuring in terms of impact, right? So when we're thinking about approaches that we need to do, things that we need to take into mind is that we need to be leveraging the data that's available to us, whether that's first party data that you get access to through retail media, or zero party data that's access to, or the data that you have today. We need to truly understand who the shopper is and how to stay relevant with them. That is highly important. I think a very important thing that we need to do is we need to drive value and engagement. We need to be able to educate those shoppers and get them into that aisle, get them to engage with the product, pick that up off a shelf, really get it into their hands. The higher likelihood that you get your product into somebody's hands, the higher likelihood they are going to act and put that into their cart and check out. And you need to give them an opportunity to have that reason to engage. Personalization, we've talked about it. It's table stakes, but it is absolutely key. So in that moment of experience, I was just on the phone with somebody before this call here, and we were talking about it. And she was mentioning, like, hey, if it's not personable and the brand's not speaking to me, I'm not buying it at the end of the day. So in that moment, when the shopper is making that experience, are we personalizing that offer, that incentive, that value to them, that's speaking to them to help with that in-store conversion, right? And then lastly, I would say another key thing that we got to really look at here is providing that clear measurement. That includes incrementality, but more importantly, understanding what is the household impact? What is that basket impact? What is the sales lift that we have? And so when you're getting pressure from your finance team, you're able to show them, the true results for the dollar in, this is what I'm getting back out that's there. All of those types of things and these things that we're mentioning here are no longer nice to haves. They're, operational requirements for brands navigating a complex, really fragmented and competitive retail landscape overall. So, when we think of this and we know that, like, hey, 60% of shoppers are still making decisions at shelf, right? We know that 54% are still doing that research. You know, are we breaking through? Are we engaging with them? Are we telling the consistent story that brought them into the store in the first place to really drive that conversion coming through? And those are areas where there are a lot of platforms, including us at Shopkick, where we have the ability to do that. Where we really do stand out is helping to drive that engagement and bring that cohesion together between that upper funnel activity to that in-store execution and that in-store engagement of your products. So as we come in and I start kind of wrapping up on what we're talking about today, summarizing everything here, in today's retail environment, disruption isn't a curveball. It is a constant. The shelf has evolved from really a transactional endpoint to a key battleground for that intention, that influence, that conversion. It's the one moment, where brand strategy, shopper intent, and execution all collide, right? It is extremely important that we get the shelf right. We get that experience right. We get that story right altogether, because that's going to mean things are going to work out better for us in the long run. I just hit on this again. I'll hit it on again. More than half of purchases are decided and are made at the shelf. You know, but again, like, as they're making those decisions, that's there. The tension spans are light, right? So we got to make sure that we're messaging personalized in a way that breaks through the clutter. you know um, how do we make sure that we adhered for and we're bringing that value to the same place? 72% of consumers say that they've switched brands this past year. Most often it's due to price, but convenience and lack of meaningful engagement are a close second and third on that list. We need to make sure that the promotional spend is a lot of money that we put out there in the market, isn't wasted because it's not relevant uh, to the shoppers. And then, so when we take that all into account, what this tells us is really clear. Showing up isn't enough. To win, brands must activate with intelligence, relevance, and measurable intent. And it's no longer reacting to change. It's about building systems that are designed to thrive. And so, really, my last four takeaways here before we open it up to questions is, number one, the shelf is now a dynamic performance channel. It's not static. I think we've hit on that a lot. The modern shoppers, they're moving fast. They're value driven. They're loyalty light. Cross-functional execution is the new competitive edge. And then, lastly, the brands that win convert behavior, right? They're not just focused on an impression, they're focused on an engagement. And that's the most important piece there. How do we drive true engagement with your products to drive sales overall? Um, that's all the content that I had to go through here today. I appreciate all of your time. If you want to learn more about any of these topics that we talked about here today, but more importantly, how Shopkick can help to cut through this clutter and help you to solve these challenges, go ahead and scan that QR code. But before we sign off, I'll turn it over to John for Q&A.
Sure, Brendan. We had several questions that came in. The first one, do you find requesting a consumer's address to be a barrier to engagement? If so, how significant is it?
A consumer's address, that's very challenging. I would say if you're asking that question, that can be really tough, and it also depends. And I think it comes down to, like, obviously privacy is a major concern, right? Everybody, that's a topic that's out there. I think it depends on how are you trying to collect that data and what is the avenue that you're trying to collect that data, and then more importantly, what you're trying to do with that data. I've seen shoppers detract when it comes down to where if they're getting asked too much. But if you're a brand direct trying to grab that directly from them one to one, I think it's what is the give and take for that, right? As long as you're providing them with value, I don't see a deterrent for it. But there will be an abundant amount of shoppers that are turned off. I mean, you think of all of the privacy laws that are popping up. You see all of the different regulations that are coming up state by state. That's mostly for an advertising purposes that are there. But I think if you're doing more one-to-one, driving people maybe to a site to enter into a sweepstakes, or you're asking them for information, you want to make sure that you're providing them with a value, and more importantly, the reason why in collecting that. But it definitely could be a barrier that you could run into because it could turn a fair amount of folks off.
Okay. Next question. Where do you see the biggest gaps between marketing, sales, and retail teams when it comes to activating at the shelf?
Where do I see the biggest gaps that come into that? That happens. Actually happens all the time. I think there's the biggest misalignment that I see with this is around the shelf today, and what success looks like there. Marketing often sees the shelf as like that final branding touch point. Sales has that dollar and cents type place, right? It's really treated as more of a trade space or a negotiation that they're having. And the retail teams, they can be looking at it more as like focus on that compliance and that merchandising. But really, in reality, the shelf is now that performance channel. It's one that demands that real time data, that agility, and that cross functional coordination between those teams. So the three critical misalignments within that, we got message fragmentation. I would say disjointed timing, where national campaigns don't match the retail execution windows. I think that's something that we all face when we're launching things. And then I say a lack of KPIs and closed loop discussions between the teams that's there. How did those marketing tactics turn into sales, and how did the sales activations turn into shopper engagements? But no one really owns that holistically that's there. So I think, when we're thinking about that, what brands can do here is really focus in on building those cross-functional shelf teams for activation between sales, shopper, and media. I think setting up those unified KPIs internally, like what's most important for you. I would say for me, those important things would be sales lift, definitely engagement rate. Like, how often are we getting shoppers to truly engage with that product? I think is absolutely key. And then, are we driving trial, and is that trial driving into conversion overall? And then lastly, what are we doing to get those insights? What are we doing to get that data and to get that information, in near real time so we can make decisions?
All right. Another question that came in. How can brands create shopper engagement that drives conversion, not just awareness, in a multi touch point journey?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, conversion starts well before the shelf, and it doesn't end at the purchase, right? To really drive it, brands must shift from exposure-based marketing tactics to more behavioral triggered engagement, and that means engaging the shopper across intent, exploration, and decision-making moments that they have, and really trying each one back to and tying each one of those back to a real outcome. So what I've seen that's really worked in that space is, obviously you have that rewards based type of engagement that's there, right? How do we incentivize pre-shopping actions and building list building, or product engagement, or learning about a product, right? Watching those videos, or truly understanding it. Again, tying that seamless digital to shelf storytelling. So meeting that shopper, where they're at today, breaking through that noise and the clutter. And if we understand that, hey, 54% of shoppers are, on their phones in the store that's right there, like, are we engaging them mobily when they're at that point of decision to really help guide them not only into the right store, but into the right area of the store to engage with your product. And then I say trial driving activations. So creating those meaningful reasons to pick up that product, not just see the product that's there. I mean, there's some of those shelves that you can look at that will really you kind of get blinded because they all really look the same, and your eyes get really blurry when you're looking at that. So how do you really drive that forward? At Shopkick, we have we've driven a 3.4x lift in purchase intent by by guiding shoppers from mobile's discovery to the physical shelf, that drives that measurable those measurable results. And some of that's like, hey, the shopper's walking in, telling them where those products specifically are at. Where can they take a look at it? Because sometimes you may expect a product to be in a certain area and it's not. So how can we guide them to those right places? But more importantly, how do we get that product in hand and get them to engage with that, to put it into their cart and really give that last moment and that reason to buy?
Okay. Yeah, the last question that I see here is, what role should solution providers play in helping brands navigate retail volatility and drive measurable performance?
Oh, that's simple. No.
Right up your alley.
Oh yeah, yeah. There we go. I mean, I feel solutions out there, shouldn't really just offer tools. Nothing should just be a tool that's available, right? This is all about developing partners, and adaptability and proof of performance. So, in a volatile market or an environment that we're in, brands need platforms that really, drive real behaviors, not reach, right? Going back to what we were talking about, hey, the shoppers move fast. It's like, how do you focus more on the engagement and more on, product in hand, cans in hands, however you want to say that, as opposed to, hey, I just got an impression and I just got an eyeball on it all day. The ability to also then adapt to channel fragmentation and shopper change is key. I mean, heck, to understand that, shoppers for groceries are going to 20.7. I don't know how you go to a point 0.7 store, but going to 20.7 store locations when they're buying their groceries, you know, how do you really, make sure that you're influenced in the right way, and then you compound the ability of e-commerce on top of that. There's a lot of choices for where these shoppers can go. So how do we avoid fragmentation and make sure that it is very cohesive, with those shoppers? And then, lastly, delivering measurement, that retailers, and finance teams trust, right? And I know that's a very interesting statement to make, considering with retail media and all the noise that's out there of, retail media networks grading their own homework, and everybody kind of telling you all these sales that are happening, and things not adding up. But when you can truly go in and be able to talk about, new buyers, that came to a product, or new to category, or new shoppers within those four brick walls, I mean, those are key things that really help to, drive impact, overall.
Okay, well, that's all the questions that came in, Brandon. Good job. I really enjoyed that and learned quite a bit. So, if attendees have further questions and want to interact with Brandon more, his email address is on the screen, brandon.strauss@shopkick.com. So, thank you again, Brandon. Have a good day.
Yep. Yep. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the time.